Who makes the best luxury sports car in 2025? Is it Porsche, Mercedes-AMG, or Aston Martin? Let's find out.
This is the latest Porsche 911 Carrera GTS, and it's very bad news for the purists. Because while the traditional Porsche styling manual has been strictly adhered to, there's something odd going on in the engine bay.
You can't see it, I mean you really can't see it, but this is now a hybrid. That's right, for the first time ever, the 911 is now partly electric.
Shocking, right? But before you worry about where you'll put the charging cable, hear me out, because Porsche has, like Porsche does, done things a little differently. Usually, a hybrid powertrain means less displacement, but not here. The engine is now a 3.6 litre with a single electric turbo, rather than a 3 litre with a twin turbo like in the previous GTS.
Meanwhile, the battery is tiny, 1.9 kilowatt hours capacity and 27 kilograms, and it's housed in the 8-speed PDK transmission. And the result in the real world is that the GTS is suddenly a lot more responsive and also a lot quicker.
0 to 62 miles an hour takes just 3 seconds, while top speed is a smidge off 200 miles an hour. More important though is how quickly the new electric turbo responds. The turbos on the old GTS took over 3 seconds to reach their peak, yet this does it in just 0.8 seconds.
The electric motor chips in with 53 brake horsepower and 111 pounds-foot of torque. That makes 534 brake horsepower in total and 450 pounds-foot of torque. That is more than a GT3 RS. But it's the faster responses that make the biggest difference. It doesn't matter whether you're in 4th gear and you suddenly put your foot down, you just get an instant surge of power, or if you start in, say, 2nd and then run it through the gears, it's on a whole different level to the previous GTS. I mean, 0 to 62 miles an hour, I don't think there's that much difference on paper, but honestly, it feels just so much more urgent, so much more responsive. Woo, this is suddenly a really, really quick car. Tell you what though, I'm not totally sure about the sound. It sounds deeper, but also not quite as authentic as previous flat six versions of this engine. It's not bad, it's not a bad sound. I'm not complaining, but yeah, it's not quite as echoey or organic sounding. It doesn't resonate quite as much as it has on previous 911s. Yeah, it's all right.
In short, it's a very, very good powertrain, but surely it's had a negative effect on the handling, right? It must be so much heavier with all that hybrid gear on board.
Actually, not really. This car weighs 1,595 kilograms, which spec for spec is about 50 kilograms more than the previous GTS. And because they've put the batteries where the starter battery used to be in the front, there's no issue with where that weight is positioned. And also the whole powertrain is about 110 millimeters lower as well, which is obviously really good for your center of gravity.
Changes to the chassis include a revised setup to handle the extra weight and the integration of the optional anti-roll stabilization into the hybrid system, thus allowing an electro-hydraulic control system for more precise control. What's more, the rear tyres are 10mm wider to deal with the extra torque.
You know, you just get in this car and it instantly feels familiar. It instantly feels fantastic. The driving position is pretty much spot on. I don't think I've got any complaints about it. You're really nice and low. You feel a proper part of the car. There's so much visibility out. And compared to other sports cars of this price range, like the Aston Martin and like the Mercedes-AMG, it just feels smaller on the road. I mean, 911s aren't as small as they used to be, but by 2025 standards, this is actually quite a dinky car for what it is. The steering wheel though, it feels absolutely fantastic in your hands. It's not too big. It's just the right width going all the way around the rim. It's nicely trimmed. The paddles feel good. They feel mechanical and responsive and solid. All these things just add up to make the driving experience feel promising before you've even set off. And then when you do start to drive it and you do start to lean on it, you get to experience all the other wonderful things, such as the steering. It's not too heavy, it's just the right weight, but it's so precise. And there's actual genuine feel. The brake pedal, softer than I was expecting, but still good feel. You know where you stand with it. And the accuracy of the steering and the way you can feel what those front wheels are doing and the way that you can then just get back on the power so early and use that 911 weight over the rear wheels. Oh, it's addictive. Got to say as well, the infotainment, super easy to use, big fan of that. The climate control dials are actual physical switches, which is a real bonus. It's a really nice interior. And the ride quality on this, whether you're just driving on the motorway or you're in town or you're on a road like this, it glides over the bumps so well. I remember driving a 991.2 GTS and I thought it was too firm. This is completely different. It rides so well. It shouldn't ride this well, but it does. Gotta say though, this car, it's not perfect. There's a couple of things. The gearbox, I don't know. It's not this bad, but I've felt quicker gearboxes in Porsches, and we know how good the PDK can be. It just doesn't feel like it's quite on the level of the rest of the powertrain. It doesn't have the sort of theatre that we've come to expect, but it's still good. And also the engine, it does feel like it's been held back a bit, which I can understand why that might be. It's already quicker than a GT3, but yeah, doesn't mean I have to like the fact that it's held back. Oh yeah, and also there's no starter key or fake key to start the engine. It's just a button, which is a shame.
But if you can get over those issues, the new 911 Carrera GTS is exceptional. A brilliant piece of engineering. But you know, what if that's just not your thing? What if you want something a bit different? Something with perhaps more theatre? What happens if you just want a V8?
Thankfully, you've still got plenty of choice. This is the latest Aston Martin Vantage. It's got a big, snarling V8 up front, 2 seats in the middle, and all the power going to the rear wheels. Simple.
Starting from £165,000, the Vantage is £30,000 more than a 911 Carrera GTS. But for that, you get a 4-litre twin-turbocharged V8, 656 brake horsepower, 590 pounds-foot of torque, and absolutely zero hybridization.
The result is an engine that still has the proper feel and sound of an old school Aston Martin. I mean, the Porsche sounded all right, but yeah, it's got absolutely nothing on this. Oh, listen to that. And it really comes alive when you put it in Sport Plus. You get the exhaust crackling and popping. It's a bit childish, yeah, but it is awesome fun and a sense of theatre as well. So good.
But you know, despite that extra 130 brake horsepower and 140 pounds-foot of torque, it doesn't actually feel any quicker than the Porsche, at least initially. The obvious culprit for this is A, actually getting the power down, and B, the weight. Aston quotes 1,605 kilograms dry, which on the road is probably closer to 1,700 kilograms, which is 100 more than the Porsche.
The engine actually responds pretty well, and it would be unfair to say that it's just a big lazy V8, because after all it's only about 400 cc's larger than the flat six in the Porsche, but obviously there is more of a feeling of heft and inertia behind it. You know, it's a V8 after all.
The end result is an engine that feels different rather than inferior to the Porsches. But on the handling front, there's clearly been an effort to bring the Vantage closer to the traditionally sharper Porsche 911. This latest Vantage gets a wider track, a stiffer body, Bilstein DTX dampers, a 50-50 weight distribution, and optional carbon ceramic brakes. As a result, it feels much flatter through the corners than any Vantage that's come before it. Plus, there's less of a sense that what you're pedaling is an engine with the rest of the car built around it. The engine is still the main event, but the chassis is now more of a match for it. It's clearly quite a rigid setup, and the body control is pretty good. But ultimately, it doesn't have the whip-it-like responses of the Porsche, and as a result, ends up feeling less agile when driven quickly.
There's no rear wheel steering on this, it's just the front wheels doing the turning, and that does hurt agility a little bit, but I think on the road, it's the size of this thing that makes the biggest difference over the Porsche. It really feels bigger. But, you know, saying that, you've got nice direct steering, it's got a nice balance to it. As I said, the body control is good. And you can obviously use your right foot to just help it round the corner a little bit. Or maybe more than a little bit, because in the cold weather, when you haven't got any kind of heat in the tyres, it is hilariously loose at the back. I mean, you'll be just trying to get round a roundabout and the traction control light will be flickering away. And it actually lets you have a little bit of movement. So that's fun when you're coming out of Sainsbury's. Brake pedal feel isn't too bad. I think the steering actually does a better job of giving you an element of feel. As far as a 2025 sports car goes, it's actually fairly communicative. And there's a slight dead spot around the middle, but otherwise you can dial into it pretty quickly.
All very encouraging, but it has to be said that the Aston's ride comfort is a way off the Porsches, and the sheer feeling of size does make it harder to drive around town. And thus, the whole idea of it being the baby Aston, it feels a little bit lost.
This cabin, it is a nice place to sit. It feels special enough. I think there's some good materials being used. I like the physical controls, but it's not as usable as the Porsches. Not at all. I mean, the infotainment system is better than the infotainment we had on the old Vantage. That was just an old Mercedes system. This isn't, but there's still issues with the responsiveness of the screen, the typeface, the menus, the settings menu is impossible to find. The digital dash in front of me is fine, but it's got these touch controls on the wheel that really aren't that easy to use. Thankfully, unlike Ferrari, where they've also got touch controls, these don't really do much. You can get by without ever really having to use them. But yeah, still, they feel like a bit of an imperfect solution, and it's plasticky and just a little bit cheap. The Porsche, it doesn't have any of those issues at all. Oh yeah, and the driving position. In isolation, this feels like a good driving position, but get in the Porsche, you are so much lower, so much more involved in the car. It's a big, big difference. So if that's important to you, yeah, you might start to find yourself immediately preferring the 911. But honestly, if you can get over those small issues, then the Vantage is such a good laugh, and it's capable, and it sounds amazing. Oh. those cars where you might look at it on paper and think, yeah, it looks great, and then you drive it, you see it, and you just think, yeah, I need that.
So, the Vantage and the 911 both tackle the same problem with very different methods that both deliver memorable results. But to make things even more complex, allow me to introduce a third way. Welcome to the second generation Mercedes-AMG GT. We absolutely adored the first one. It epitomised everything that AMG did well. A bruisingly loud V8, jaw-dropping looks, and an absolutely wicked sense of humour to go with it. It was raw, but what a car it was.
On paper at least, things are a little bit different now. This 63 4MATIC Plus Coupe starts from about £165,000, which is a lot more than its equivalent predecessor. It's also gained a couple of extra seats, and on this version, an extra drive shaft, so it's all-wheel drive.
AMG has clearly dialed back from the snarling monster that came before. This generation shared development with the luxury SL Roadster, and although AMG insists that they're two very different cars, you can see the influence. The new GT is longer, wider, taller, and while more powerful, is about 300 kilograms heavier than the previous gen GTS model. What's more, the old dual-clutch rear-mounted transaxle gearbox has been swapped out for a 9-speed auto attached directly to the engine. As a result, the weight distribution has shifted from a 47-53 rear bias to a 54-46 front bias.
Yeah, there's some telling numbers that might have already put you off this car, but honestly, stick around because there's one very good reason that you should remain interested. That thing.
Despite changing pretty much everything else, AMG has kept the 4-litre twin-turbo V8. In this spec, it makes 577 brake horsepower and 590 pounds-foot of torque.
Yes, as an engine it shares a lot with the Aston Martin, and we've already talked about that when we were in that car. But also, A, it's a V8, you can never have too much of a good thing, and B, especially now, when the vultures are circling and we don't know how long we're going to have engines like this, it's good to celebrate it whenever they come along. And if that's two at once, then so be it.
0 to 62 miles an hour is done in 3.2 seconds, 3/10 quicker than the lighter and more powerful Vantage, owing to the all-wheel drive. And so, it's not just about old-school charm. It is effective. But if I had to choose, I'd say the Aston's V8 feels more engaging, and it sounds better, and unsurprisingly, it breathes a little bit freer.
I mean, admittedly, this isn't even the Pro version of the 63. That gets you an extra 27 brake horsepower and some added sharpness. And if that's not enough, there's a plug-in hybrid model that makes 805 brake horsepower and 1,047 pounds-foot of torque. But you know, in isolation, it's hard to argue that this 63 version isn't more than adequate.
Speaking of more than adequate, the AMG's cabin is pretty decent. You can't see it now, but the excellent ambient lighting is one of AMG's hallmarks. The seating position is good. There's lots of customization for the infotainment, and there's even a set of rear seats. I mean, yeah, they're pretty useless for adults, but if you're taking the kids to school, they might just do the job.
I think the only real negative with this interior is that it feels like they've taken a regular Mercedes interior and just stretched it out over a two-door GT cabin. It doesn't feel like it's been specially designed. It's a bit awkward with this big central screen taking center stage. It just doesn't feel like your top of the range GT sports car. But having said that, this screen and the infotainment system that's behind it is way better than the one in the Aston Martin, and it's a lot more usable. I mean, there's still too much going on the steering wheel, but, you know, you take the improvements where you can get them.
So, the AMG's V8 gives it a real chance. But as I just alluded to, the GT is the heaviest car here by a long way if you take the manufacturer figures as gospel. At 2.1 tons, it's about 400 kilograms more than the Vantage and 500 kilograms more than the Porsche. And that is a huge difference.
It's very obvious that the Porsche is a lot lighter than this. You can tell immediately. But what's interesting is that although the Aston Martin on paper is also a lot lighter, it doesn't really feel it. In fact, this feels more tied down and responsive at the front end, and because you've got the combination of all-wheel drive and the standard fit all-wheel steering, which you don't have either on the Aston Martin, it's also a lot more stable, so you can just go into a corner with more confidence, and you can come out of the corner with more confidence, and there's no problems at all. The steering is nice and direct, it's nice and precise, and it gives you confidence in where you're putting the front end of this car. Unfortunately though, it does feel a bit gloopy and reluctant to self-center. It's not the end of the world, but it's not as pure as the Aston Martin steering, and it's nowhere near the quality of the steering on the Porsche.
What's interesting with the GT is that the previous version was ultra-mobile at the rear, much like the Vantage is now, whereas the latest version flips that completely on its head.
I think what's great about this car is that it's a really useful thing to tackle an unfamiliar road in. I reckon you could jump in this and immediately go as quick and be as confident as you would be in the Porsche, just because it always feels like it's on your side. I know the steering's not perfect, but the brake pedal's got good feel to it. Maybe a bit grabby, but yeah, good feel nonetheless. And it just feels like a big, solid thing that is still capable of putting a smile on your face, both in a straight line with that AMG engine and the noises from the exhaust, which are a bit childish, but still good fun. But also because when you do go into a corner, it really hangs on. Does not feel anywhere near as heavy as the brochure says it is. I do just wish though that there was a middle ground between this and the Vantage, because it feels like the Vantage has taken the place of where the AMG GT used to be, and this has certainly been dialed back, and I could have done with a little bit more of that AMG GT magic, but perhaps slightly less of its exuberance in the Vantage, because you can use the power in this thing, you can put your foot down, no problem at all, and really enjoy it. In the Vantage, unless the weather is absolutely perfect, you're going to be constantly just managing that rear end, whereas this is the opposite.
Meanwhile, comfort is a bit of a mixed bag in the AMG. On a cruise, it's good, but the ride does suffer around town in the same way the Vantage's does. In order to cope with the weight, there's an inherent stiffness to the car that really shows its head over low-speed bumps and cracks in the road. So, which car wins this test? Well, clearly personal preference is going to shape much of the buying decision when it comes to choosing between these three sports cars. You might decide that you can't live without a V8, or you might only want all-wheel drive, or perhaps the rear seats of the AMG will be a deal breaker. But for me, the Porsche has the best driving position, the best responses, the best handling, and an engine that is technically astonishing. As a sports car, it's in a different league.
The thing is though, is that when you have all of those superlatives, you usually have to counter them with some negative points, such as, the ride's not very good or the cabin isn't very usable. But with this, you don't have that. It's got the best ride of the three cars, and the interior is the best of the three, chiefly because of how usable it is. So when you've got that ability that just goes across the board, and when there's no obvious weak points, the only conclusion you can come to is that this is the best car. As much as I love the V8s in the Vantage and the GT, no, this is the best. I don't really have any doubt about that. It's phenomenal.